Hello. I hate novels, or full stories as my sister once called them, which I think is a bit of a weird thing to say, because in my opinion a story should be exactly as long as it needs to be. I think that classifying stories as full stories, or considering them incomplete if they aren't long enough, is the sort of idea that leads to the exact sort of thing that I hate about novels. Or, I guess it would be more accurate to say, the reason why I have not enjoyed the majority of novels that I've read. They're overly long, spread out, details are expanded upon for paragraphs and paragraphs, and ultimately it leads to a conclusion that I feel wasn't worth it. However, it wasn't always this way. I used to read lots of novels all the time. I think it would be fair to say that they were ruined for me by one book in particular. This is The Worm Ouroboros, an absolutely fascinating book and the subject of today's video. It does the things that I just talked about disliking in other novels. It is overly long. Descriptions go on for paragraphs upon paragraphs, and ultimately, depending on how you look at it, it might be the stupidest thing you've ever read. But it's also fucking awesome. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. I don't want to spoil too much too quickly about this 100-year-old book, so I'll begin with sort of the general positives and negatives and such, and then hopefully give you a bit of a warning before I go into grander spoiler talk, and then my conclusion. So let's get right into it. The Worm Ouroboros is a book written by a man named E.R. Edison, Eric Rucker, I believe, Edison, initially published in 1922. It was his first sort of major fantasy publication. He had only one publication before this, and it was this kind of memoir to his friend who had died. So this was his first kind of fully fictional fantasy book. And there's a small point of interest there because a lot of fiction and fantasy writers tend to release works all throughout their lives, often from an early age. Edison did not release The Worm Ouroboros until he was 40. Rank D. Perhaps even more interesting is that a lot of the characters and ideas in this book can be traced back to characters and stories dreamed up in Edison's childhood. As well, you can see some clear influence from a number of sources, including some Icelandic sagas, which is evidenced by the way that he writes some of his bigger heroes and kings, and also some of the other works that Edison released in his lifetime, as well as Shakespeare, which can be seen in the way that dialogue is often written between characters, and of course the occasional direct passage taken from Shakespeare. And as well in there you get notes of sort of an Arthurian influence, again with the larger-than-life noble kings and conquest and adventure and all that. It's just overall quite a fascinating read. So was it worth the wait? Sort of. It's a good book, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't really a financial success, similar to how Shakespeare's tragedies didn't sell well back in the day. Until years and years later, when The Lord of the Rings sort of revitalized the fantasy scene, and people gained a new appreciation for The Worm Ouroboros. And speaking of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien will come back up a few more times, so stay tuned. But perhaps as a little teaser, they put a quote from him on the sort of sequel trilogy to The Worm Ouroboros, the Zimyamvia trilogy. They put a quote from him right on the cover. They're very proud of it. Let's see what it says. It says, "The greatest and most convincing writer of invented worlds that I have read, J.R.R. Tolkien." So let's get into it. What is the book actually about? Demons fighting witches on Mercury. And I know that sounds pretty fucked, but what you have to understand about The Worm Ouroboros is that while there are sort of other factions, nations, races, similar to modern fantasy, they're all essentially just human. So it's really more like countries in a real-life world type setting, rather than all sorts of zany creatures fighting on a crazy alien planet. And there's magic. Don't forget, there's magic too, of course. But through all, we have, larger-than-life battles, huge, large-scale wars and invasions, great heroes doing daring feats of excellence. But ultimately, the thing that makes the book so attractive, the thing that puts this book above others and is the reason why I'm making this video, is the actual prose, the writing style. The way that Edison weaves together his words is monumental. There's a word that he really liked, that he used a few times throughout the worm Ouroboros and a few of his other works. That word being ensorcelled, which I like quite a bit as well. And when I read this book, I feel ensorcelled. When I was just looking for quotes and passages to make this video, I found myself just beginning to read through it without even realizing, and having to stop and be like, okay, no, I have to make the video now. It's sort of this 17th century-esque prose that also takes a lot of cues from Shakespeare and weaves together a often quite complex but really satisfying description and action and dialogue and everything. Now, the worm Ouroboros does have some length to it. It's almost 400 pages, according to my version, but compare it to a book like Stephen King's Under the Dome or Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, and you'll see, those books could be a hell of a lot shorter. This book, I would not take a word away. In fact, I'd like a hell of a lot more. I would like it to be 10 times as long as it is. And that's something you will never hear from me on a different book. So, though I don't really have much to say on it, because what can I say? I think really the best way is just to read some of his prose and see for yourself. But regardless of all of that, I will say that is the number one drawing point to this novel, and it is most certainly enough to justify reading it. So if that is something that you're interested in, I gotta say, I definitely recommend this book. And now we're going to kind of shift a bit, because while that writing style is what attracts me to the book, it can also be a bit detrimental in some ways. For instance, if some of my friends might have low attention spans, or if they don't speak English natively, if they're still learning to speak English, it's very hard to recommend this book. You can imagine just now getting the grasp of modern conventional English and then suddenly being thrust into this very old, intentionally obscure version of it. It wouldn't be easy. Compounding that, in addition, as well, on top of that, plus, when characters in the novel write letters, they don't use standardized spelling, so the words are sort of sounded out, which, again, can make it even harder to get through the text. But in my opinion, I assure you, in my opinion, it's worth it. And while we're on the subject of quirks of the novel does have a framing device that, interestingly, only appears at the beginning. Typically, with a framing device, it sort of frames the narrative, oftentimes at the start and at the finish, but this one just appears at the beginning. The story starts with us following this guy named Lessingham. He would supposedly be our protagonist if you're just reading for the first time and don't know what's to come. But then, very quickly as the novel progresses, he sort of gets pushed to the wayside and then forgotten. And he never comes back. You never see him again after that. So that's kind of interesting. But we'll come back to that later, unlike Edison. Got him! But Edison himself was a bit quirked up as well. As I already mentioned, a lot of his characters and ideas were taken from his childhood, and what this means in a lot of cases is that they have some very strange names and very kind of childish identities to them. And something that I find really cute related to that is that Edison places these notes on pronunciation at the start of both the worm Ouroboros and this collection of the Zimyamvia stories. I'm not quite sure which book the note initially belonged to, but it's kind of there at the start of the book, at the start of the whole trilogy. I like that he says proper names the reader will no doubt pronounce as he chooses, but perhaps to please me. And then he goes into how things should be pronounced. It's very cute. It's like, I can't resist it. But I will have to say that it does kind of bring out just how strange some of these names are. For instance, this one here, I always pronounced just as Goris. That's what made sense to me. That's what my internal monologue would say when I read it as a child. Just Goris. Oh, King Goris. But here, he makes it clear that it's meant to rhyme with thrice, meaning that it would be more like go rice. And I hate that. That's awful. And Edison's childish nature can sort of further be seen in this letter exchange between him and Richard Dodson, where Dodson criticizes the setting of Mercury, saying that it's too small and too close to the sun, it would be too hot, it's not a good setting for his crazy fantasy book. And Edison, much like a boy on the playground pretending to put up a magical force field against all powers, just says, I meant it as pure convention. The world of the worm is so obviously Earth-like that it should make the reader dismiss any idea of astronomical accuracy. Probably the martlet just told Lessingham it was Mercury in order to stop him asking too many questions. If it looks like Earth, just pretend it's Earth. Shut up. And then later in that same letter, I believe Dodson asks about the induction and the incomplete framing device, to which Edison replies, Lessingham and the whole induction are perhaps little more than machinery for letting the reader down gently into another world. But then he goes on to say, personally, he has an affection for Lessingham and his wife, and he's glad he made their acquaintance in this book. Which I find quite funny. I find that a bit amusing. So while I've got my laptop sitting here, let's actually return to that Tolkien quote from earlier. I'm going to expand it and show kind of the whole paragraph about Edison and then talk about it a bit. So in total, what Tolkien actually said about Edison is as follows. I read the works of Edison long after they appeared, and I once met him. I heard him in Mr. Lewis's room, that's C.S. Lewis, in Magdalen College read aloud some parts of his own works, from the mistress of mistresses, as far as I remember. He did it extremely well. I read his works with great enjoyment for their sheer literary merit. My opinion of them is almost the same as that expressed by Mr. Lewis on page 104 of the essays presented to Charles Williams. And of course, that quote is as follows. Every episode, every speech helps to incarnate what the author is imagining. You could spare none of them. It takes the whole story to build up that strange blend of Renaissance luxury and northern hardness. The secret here is largely the style, and especially the style of the dialogue. These proud, reckless, amorous people create themselves and the whole atmosphere of their world, chiefly by talking. Except, going back to Tolkien's quote here, except that I disliked his characters, always excepting the Lord Grow, who we will also talk about later, and despised what he appeared to admire more intensely than Mr. Lewis at any rate saw fit to say of himself. Edison thought what I admire soft. That's kind of funny, come on. His word, one of complete condemnation, I gathered. I thought that, corrupted by an evil and indeed silly philosophy, he was coming to admire more and more arrogance and cruelty. Incidentally, I thought his nomenclature slipshod and often inept. In spite of all of which, I still think of him as the greatest and most convincing writer of invented worlds that I have read. But he was certainly not an influence. That last line is particularly interesting to me because I've often seen people say that Tolkien was inspired by Edison. But according to this, that might not be entirely true. And by the way, whether or not it's true, I think things like this are just a bit exploitative, a bit strange, a bit pathetic. Why'd you change the name to Dragon? What the fuck is that? Anyway, this excerpt comes from a letter that he had written to Carolyn Everett in response to a letter she wrote him trying to get some information for her thesis. And I can't actually find the letter that she sent to him. I searched fairly hard. I couldn't find it. If someone else can find it, give me it. I want it. But without that letter, I'm not entirely sure what question was asked to make him say he was certainly not an influence. I would assume it was something to do with writing The Lord of the Rings or his grander works as a whole. I would assume that this is indicating that, in fact, Edison was not an influence on Tolkien, but I can't say 100% for sure because I don't have the letter. However, in Carolyn Everett's actual thesis, which I do have access to, in the section on influences on Tolkien's works, Edison does not appear. So take that as you will. Now, looking back at that quote, I want to focus in on this idea of Edison's philosophy, because that is another thing that might either interest you or turn you off about the book. As you might have guessed from my previous description of the grand heroes and kings and such present in Edison's work, there isn't much in the way of that traditional sort of coming-of-age underdog story that a lot of people have become accustomed to. And thus, there might not be that kind of young adult self-insert type feel whatsoever. It may be indeed quite alienating to read the story of these characters that you may not have much to do with at all. Characters that are already the biggest and strongest warriors and kings of the land and revered by all and feared and respected by their enemies. And, you know, it already begins with them being a collection of the biggest and baddest dudes of all time. And then you watch them fight. If you're into that, there you go. If you're not, what can I say? And that nobility is kind of explored in all of its aspects, in that subordinates are treated like subordinates, and common soldiers are killed by the droves for the larger battle at hand, the larger war, the dispute going on between these great, eminent figures. And on the other hand, while all of the common loyal men are sort of disposable, great enemies are treated with as much respect as a friend or family member. And I do sort of like this trope when it appears. I liked it in Fist of the North Star when Kenshiro would beat the shit out of a dude and then call him his friend. You know, I like that kind of stuff. It's silly, it can be fun, but it does sort of add to the overall idea of like these particular people meaning more and mattering more than anyone else, which may or may not be up your alley, may or may not be the kind of thing that a compelling story can consist of. Quick little aside here, because I'm not really sure where else to put it. If you were wondering if the book that constantly describes big, strong men and their affections for each other gets a little homoerotic at points, it does, as demonstrated by this scene where the king is taking a bath while Lord Grow drinks beside him. And I know that when I've been in that situation, it gets quite homo. But that is beside the point. Back into it. And this is where I'm gonna have to say that I'm starting to get into spoilers here, so if you don't want this 100-year-old book spoiled in more detail than I've already kind of hinted at, skip to that time code, and I will give you my final thoughts and close the video out. But you don't close the video. The main thing I want to spoil here first and foremost is, I guess, the conclusion, sort of. Not the actual ending, but how things end up. The demons win. Yay. Those are our guys. The demons, protagonists, they did it. They beat the witches. And then here at the end, where they're sort of just chilling, is where I want to focus for a second. I want to touch on how the ideology of the characters, and indeed sometimes the world, can kind of dip into a bit of a problematic territory. In the Wikipedia article for this book, currently as of making this video, they sort of make it seem like Goldry Bluzco says this, in that there's a comparison between Witchland and Impland, and the lords of Witchland are held in high regard because they're strong opponents, but the people of Impland are referred to as uncivil races. And this is a bit misleading for how it is in the actual book. Goldry Bluzco doesn't actually say that himself Instead, it is Queen Sophonisba, who's sort of a third party and eventually joins the demons near the end, who makes the comparison and calls them uncivil races of Impland. Goldry Bluzko then agrees and goes on to call them feeble savages.
Bruh.
They're all essentially just human.
Bruh.
Arguably, possibly worse. Not a good look, brother. We are right at the end. There was this much left, and you just had to say it. You just had to say uncivil races and feeble savages, didn't you? God. Now, here's the thing. Protagonist doesn't necessarily mean good guy, right? I mean, the characters, they're literally called demons. I mean, yes, they are the main characters, and they fight for justice, and they're described beautifully, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're good guys, as evidenced by this, and evidenced even before the events of the novel begin. According to this little timeline that's provided, right before the events of the novel, they genocide all the ghouls. The ghouls are killed, eliminated entirely. It makes sense to a certain degree for these people who so highly respect prowess in combat to praise enemies that gave them a hard time and sort of discriminate against the peoples that they view as weak. It is definitely rotten, and I don't agree with it, of course, but it is in line with what we've seen of the demons and what we know of them through the whole novel. And I think, honestly, this raises a lot of questions, not just about the philosophy of the book or perhaps of Edison himself, but rather what this world reflects and what it could mean and what sort of things we can take away from it. Because it is markedly different from the real modern conventional world, but also ideas like this and biases and stuff like that are direct reflections of reality. And you can definitely read that as perhaps Edison himself. I mean, being that Queen Sophonisba and Goldry Bluzko are kind of two different parties, they don't entirely agree on everything all the time, but they agree that the imps are, feeble, uncivil savages. That kind of makes it seem more like it's a broader idea. It's perhaps the book that's saying that, or Edison that's saying that. But I feel like that's kind of discounting what could be there, what you could get out of this book. Because much like the millions of interpretations of Shakespeare's works that you may see in any given English class, I feel like there are some interesting interpretations you could give to this book. I feel like the way that it's presented, the fact that everything is so hyper-detailed, so taken to the extreme, these characters are so grand, so noble, so strong, and everything is described in this way that makes it seem like, it's so great, kind of makes it feel like it could be a satirical exploration of it. I'm not at all saying that it was intended to be, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be. It's sort of the opposite of a couple of really good movies, interestingly enough made by the same director, Starship Troopers and RoboCop. Both films were sort of made or intended to be critiques of, war and action kind of bravado and that kind of culture, but because they were so well made and so entertaining, kind of the very people that they were criticizing adopted those films. They were like, that's awesome. I love war and killing. Yes, you made a movie that speaks to me, even though they were sort of intended to criticize that. I feel like in much the same way, even if Edison intended things to be read straightforward and exactly as he wrote them, and everything in there is a reflection of his real feelings and that's who he is, that doesn't change what you can get out of it from reading it as a critique of those very things, reading it as an exploration of kind of what happens when that is the world, when your whole world is like that, which is fun. So now I want to shift into the real big spoilers and talk about the ending, and in order to do that, I kind of have to establish the story as a whole. So we're going to give a brief summary here. We begin with the Lords of Demonland after Lessingham arrives at their palace. And they're chilling out. They're the biggest, strongest, coolest dudes of all time. They're just having a ball when a messenger from Witchland appears. And he basically just says, "Give me some money." Witchland is demanding tribute from Demonland for no particular reason, just to kind of be dicks. And so in response, they say, "Well, we're not going to do that, but what we will do is we'll wrestle you." And so the King of Witchland, King Go-Rice, comes out to the Foliate Isles, this kind of third-party neutral ground, and there he wrestles the mighty demon champion Goldry Bluzko. And this scene is really fucking awesome, so I kind of want to just explore it in its entirety. There are a couple scenes I want to explore in their entirety during this section. This is the first one. I can talk about some of my favorite scenes, right? The book's 100 years old. It's public domain. Look, I'm scrolling through the whole fucking thing right now. Wow. So, when it begins, they're pretty evenly matched. They fight pretty ferociously, but they can't really get a definitive one-up on each other, which is great. It establishes that tension, establishes, even though Goldry is this grand, strong champion, the Witch King's not too bad either, and shouldn't be taken lightly. But because they're so evenly matched, the king gets a little impatient, perhaps a little worried, a little insecure, and he goes, "Fuck it, I'm gonna cheat." And he shoves his fingers up Goldry's nose and starts scratching his nostrils during the next bout, which causes him to lose his groove, and Go-Rice wins that round. And of course, Goldry is immediately like, "Ref,
He stuck his fingers up my nose. That's illegal. That is illegal."
And they do nothing. They do nothing about it because the witches are very intimidating, and they kind of make it clear that he shouldn't get involved. So the ref kind of backs away. He's sort of just like, "Oh, I didn't see anything." And this leads us to probably my favorite paragraph in the entire book. When Goldry realizes that he's not going to be helped here, that the king just cheated and no one's going to do anything, he gets fucking pissed. As soon as the next round begins, Goldry runs at the king, fucking screaming, grabs his ass, and then just slams him into the ground, right on his head, so hard that fucking shit comes out of his ears, he's dead. His fucking whole cranium zone has been compressed. He's been hydraulic press channeled. He's done. It's over. And then Goldry's brethren, Juss and Spitfire, after witnessing the most badass shit I've ever seen, bear him up on either side and put his cloak of cloth of gold worked with red hearts about his mighty limbs. And he fucking just swaggers off like a G with that absolute dripping cloak. Amazing. Incredible. I love that scene. It's great. And then to sort of add on to that in the next paragraph, they lift up the king, and Edison just writes, "But the king was stone dead." I like that. But that is kind of the grander inciting incident that begins the events of the rest of the novel, because the interesting thing about the King of Witchland is that it's kind of always been Go-Rice. He reincarnates every time he's killed. So in that match, King Go-Rice the 11th was slain. And at the same time, way back in Witchland, King Go-Rice the 12th is born. And so while the demons are slowly making their way back home, King Go-Rice the 12th is like, "I gotta do something." So he casts some very evil, very dangerous dark magic to summon up this great sea serpent to kind of intercept the boys on their way home and carry off Goldry Bluzko. And what's great about this is they never think that he's dead. They never, consider the possibility that this giant sea serpent swallowing up Goldry Bluzko means that he's dead. They immediately work toward going to rescue him. And that is what makes up a lot of the plot of the novel, is alongside this war with Witchland, they're also going to rescue Goldry from this imprisonment, which is also really sick, because he's imprisoned on this mountain that has this special enchantment about it, basically making it so that you can't climb that mountain unless you've already looked down upon it. So it's the second tallest mountain, and you need to climb the first tallest mountain so that you can first look down on it, and then you can climb it. It's fucked. I like it. They battle a manticore there. It's sick. But that's sort of how the book moves along. We see large-scale battles between the witches and the demons, all the while, kind of more privately, the demons are attempting to free Goldry, who will, of course, aid them in their quest if they do manage to, because he is this great and awesome hero, much like they also are. Now, having done all of that, and already described one of the scenes that I wanted to talk about, I ought to talk about the other scene. And in stark contrast with that wrestling match, this is a very short, brief, sudden action that I think has its own way of being very intense and captivating. This is, of course, on the character Lord Grow, and again, I am spoiling, and his eventual death. And Lord Grow as a character is immediately interesting because he seems to be perhaps the only character that actually acts like a bit of a human being and not an amalgamation of all masculine features ever imagined into one giant leathery behemoth. You know, he's more of like a real kind of guy, which is why oftentimes he's treated as a coward and labeled as a traitor. He does switch sides a few times, but nonetheless. So to go through a brief history of Lord Grow, he began as a goblin. He was in fact the adopted brother of the king of the goblins, so in a very good position. And then, eventually, in time, he went to join the witches, and throughout the events of the novel, he kind of switches back and forth between the witches and the demons. He just kind of goes where he feels that he's needed. He really follows his heart, which, again, makes him a coward and a traitor. So with what we've already established about Lord Grow, his death scene is interesting because it's really quick, and it's a bit poetic. He dies during one of the big final battles between the witches and the demons. He's currently fighting on the side of Demonland, and he runs in, fighting some witches. He slays one of the witches, and this act is seen by Corund, one of the big generals of Witchland. And Corund says to him, "O land skip of iniquity, shalt thou kill beside me the men of mine household? But my friendship sitteth not on a weather vane. Live, and be a traitor." This gets to Grow. Grow recognizes that, that probably didn't sit with him too well. So, immediately he goes, "'Tis easy remedied," and turns around and kills one of the soldiers of Demonland. But this is where he makes a fatal error, because unlike the killing of a witch seen by Corund, the killing of the demon was seen by Spitfire. The weakest of the demon lords, but still one of the demon lords. He sees Grow, immediately runs at him, and rushing in, thrust him through the buckler into the brain. Grow was attempting to block the blow like a fool, and Spitfire just went right through it into his brain, murdering him. And that's the end of Lord Grow. But then Edison gives Lord Grow this final paragraph where he says, "In such wise and by such a sudden vengeance did the Lord Grow most miserably end his life days, who, being a philosopher and a man of peace, careless of particular things of earth, had followed and observed all his days steadfastly one heavenly star. Yet now in the bloody battle before Carce?
Phryne.
Frine.
Freenay.
Carce? Died, in the common opinion of men, a manifold perjured traitor, that had at length gotten the guerdon of his guile." It's interesting. It's a strangely human and relatable character given a cruel fate time and time again until his untimely death, ultimately, seemingly, perhaps caused by his own foolishness. Although Edison tries to sort of make it seem as if it was what seemed most logical to him. It was what seemed to be the way to make things right. Not really sure what to say on that, but it is, in fact, quite intriguing. And without that final little paragraph on Lord Grow, it would be quite a quick death indeed for a major named character. So the book has a lot to offer in terms of how you see characters get absolutely murderized. And so they go through all of this hardship. They scale the mountains. They battle the Manticore. Thousands upon thousands of men are killed. Finally, they manage to kind of start cornering the witches in their grand tower. And during that time, as the demons are closing in, the witches have this sort of Shakespearean infighting going on, which leads to a lot of them being poisoned. And at the same time, King Goreis XII, up in his tower, is attempting another magic casting like he did to summon the sea serpent, only this time he fucks it up, because like I said, it's very dangerous magic. And so his entire kind of casting tower, where he's up there, casting spells and shit, just fucking explodes, just gets violently ripped apart by God. And with that, the demons are sort of victorious. They go home, everyone's psyched, and Queen Sophonisba tells Lord Juss, who is kind of the mainest protagonist of the demon lords, she says, "I will grant you one wish. You can wish for anything. I will grant you one wish for your heroic deeds. And let me just ask you, what do you think they would possibly wish for? After all of this struggle, all of this strife, all of this bloodshed, what would men like this wish for?" To do it all again, baby. Let's go! Sorry. But yes, the book does end looping back to the arrival of the messenger from Witchland, which I think is a really, really cool ending for a number of reasons. First of all, when I first read it as a kid, it blew my mind. I'd never seen a story end like that. And I know now, as a man, that a lot of stories have that looping nature to them. A lot of people think it's really smart to make a story that ends the same way it starts. But this one is particularly interesting because it doesn't end the way it starts. It's a loop back to like 20 pages in. It's a loop back to after Lessingham has already arrived at the end of our framing device. And that creates a really cool effect, where essentially the framing device is kind of dumping us into this loop, and now we're stuck in it. Lessingham may have escaped. We never hear from him again, and he's only seen in that frame, coming into Demonland and then disappearing. The reader, however, gets stuck. We're in the loop. We loop back to Witchland coming again. We don't get the end of the framing device where we go back to Lessingham's house. We are stuck on Mercury. I like that. And it also ties in with, of course, the title and sort of the theme of the circular nature of things. The king being reincarnated. There's these three armies that the demons meet that are eternally chasing each other in a big circle. There's lots of imagery about cycles and circles and the self-consuming serpent. And I just think it's really cool. I think it's really neat. It's a neat story. So let's get into my conclusion now, and welcome back those of you who skipped ahead. Hi. Ultimately, I think Edison is best described as a man clinging to the past, and that comes through in this work as well. The characters and ideas from his childhood, the 17th century-esque prose, constant pedestals to Shakespeare and Homer and Sappho and so on, and of course, that rotten, strange philosophy, which comes back up again in the Zimyamvia trilogy, referred to as rank bad philosophy, which Paul Edmund Thomas sort of expands upon in his introduction to the 1992 collection that I have right here. He cites a section from the beginning of Mistress of Mistresses in which Lessingham says, "Truth is but to say that beauty and goodness are the ultimate reality, and goodness is servant to beauty. Are not the gods protean?" To which the narrator, who is also the person he's speaking to in the scene, says, "Rank bad philosophy, as I soon learned when I had made some progress in metaphysics. And yet it was out of such marsh fires that he built up in secret places of his mind a palace of pleasure or house of heart's desire, a creed, a myth, a fabric of pure poetry." And Thomas's takeaway from this sort of ties into what I've been talking about with Edison's philosophies. saying that Edison did not create Edward Lessingham in his own image, autobiographically, but many of Edison's attitudes and opinions issue from Lessingham's lips. Lessingham's ambiguous theological statement contains beliefs that Edison also maintained, and so the narrator's rebuke, rank bad philosophy, can be directed at Edison himself. Edison would not deny the charge, because by the time he came to write the Zemyambian novels, Edison had read enough philosophy to know that some of his personal opinions about theology and existence were beliefs, and not defensible arguments that could stand up to modern philosophical analysis. And yet, from these beliefs, these marsh fires, Edison built the heaven of Zemyambia, in the secret places of his mind. Now, I think that a similar thing could be said of the philosophies presented by the characters in the worm Ouroboros. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing for him to both acknowledge that it's bad philosophy and then also continue to write about it and possibly perform it. But then again, it may also lend itself to that more critical/satirical approach to the narrative. So take it as you will. And what we get when we put all of this together, the rank bad philosophy, the clinging to childhood names and ideas, the extremely intricate and ensorceling prose, is a novel that I simply cannot help but recommend. It's not for everyone, it certainly has its flaws, it certainly has critiques that you can make of it, but the end product, the result, is something that is uniquely interesting and entertaining on every level, from the smallest sentence to whole chapters and movements and the overall idea of the book. If you are interested in reading it, as I said, it is public domain and freely available. Project Gutenberg has a good copy of it over at gutenberg.org. They even fixed one of the typos I found in my hardcover version, so I give them my seal of approval. Epic. I want to conclude by reading the first section of the introduction to the worm Ouroboros, written by James Stevens, which also serves as the text on the back of my version of the book, and I think is a bit of a silly, perhaps extravagant way of advertising the novel, but I think it's also kind of cool, so that's what we're going to do. And it reads, "The worm Ouroboros, no worm, but the serpent itself, is a wonderful book. As a story or as prose, it is wonderful, and, there being a cause for every effect, the reason for writing it should be as marvelous again. Shelley had to write the Prometheus Unbound. He was under compulsion, for a superhuman energy had come upon him, and he was forced to create a matter that would permit him to imagine and think and speak like a god. It was so with Blake, who willed to appear as a man but existed like a mountain, and, at their best, the work of these poets is inhuman and sacred. It does not greatly matter that they had or had not a message. It does not matter at all that either can be charged with nonsense or that both have been called madmen. The same charge might be laid against a volcano or a thunderbolt, or this book. It does not matter that they could transcend human endurance and could move tranquilly in realms where lightning is the norm of speed. The work of such poets is sacred because it outpaces man, and, in a realm of their own, wins even above Shakespeare." Good night, everyone.